Maps do not just show land and water, they show power, ambition, fear, and control. When we look at Africa on a modern map, it feels permanent and settled. But this picture is new and fragile. For thousands of years, Africa was drawn and redrawn by travelers, kings, conquerors, traders, and colonizers. Every line on the continent tells a story of belief and struggle. Some maps erased entire civilizations. Some maps invented kingdoms that never existed. Some maps justified slavery, conquest, and empire. Africa is the most mapped and mismapped continent in human history. Before Europeans arrived, Africans already had complex knowledge of geography. Trade routes crossed deserts, rivers, and forests with precision. Empires knew where gold flowed and where danger waited. Yet when foreign powers began drawing Africa, they did not seek truth. They sought ownership. A map became a weapon more powerful than any army. With ink and paper, borders were created that split families, cultures, and nations. Wars were born from straight lines that ignored reality. Even today, conflicts in Africa trace back to old maps, drawn in distant rooms by men who never touched African soil. This story is not about paper. It is about how vision shapes destiny. It is about how a continent was imagined, claimed, and reshaped again and again. Each map changed history in ways that still echo today. From ancient Greek sketches to colonial partitions to modern political borders, Africa has been a canvas for human ambition. To understand Africa, you must understand its maps, because whoever draws the map controls the story. This journey will take you through moments when a single drawing altered the fate of millions. It will reveal how Africa was once the center of the world and later pushed to the margins by distorted designs. These maps decided who was rich and who was enslaved, who ruled and who was erased. They shaped trade, religion, warfare, and identity, and they continue to influence the present. What you are about to hear is not taught in classrooms. It is hidden behind lines and legends. These are the African maps that changed history, and once you see them, you will never look at Africa the same way again. Long before Europe looked south, Africa already existed in the minds of ancient civilizations. The earliest known maps of Africa came from ancient Egypt. Egyptians did not draw maps for decoration. They drew them for survival. The Nile was their lifeline, and their maps followed its flow with accuracy and reverence. Temples recorded routes to gold. Mines in Nubia and Punt. These were not symbolic drawings. They were practical guides for trade and power. Africa was not a mystery to Africans. It was home. At the same time, Greek thinkers began imagining Africa from afar. Herodotus wrote of Libya, which included much of Africa north of the Sahara. Greek maps were limited by distance, but they introduced a dangerous idea. They treated Africa as an object to be described rather than a world to be lived in. Ptolemy later created one of the most influential world maps in history. His map included Africa, but distorted its size and shape. Rivers were misplaced, mountains invented, and the interior filled with speculation. Yet his work became authoritative for centuries. This mattered because future mapmakers trusted his vision more than African knowledge. Africa became something to be guessed rather than understood. As Rome expanded its influence, Roman maps focused on control. Roads, ports, and provinces were clearly marked in North Africa. Everything beyond the Sahara faded into uncertainty. This blank space was not ignorance. It was opportunity. Empty spaces invited imagination and conquest. As centuries passed, Islamic scholars transformed African mapping. Trade across the Sahara connected West Africa to the wider world. Scholars in cities like Timbuktu understood routes, climates, and peoples. The map of Al-Idrisi in the 12th century was revolutionary. It showed Africa with detail, rivers, cities, and trade networks. It challenged European assumptions and proved Africa was connected and complex. However, Europe was entering an age of expansion. When Portuguese explorers began sailing down the African coast, they carried maps that mixed science and myth. Early Portolan charts showed coastlines accurately, but the interior remained a mystery. This created a dangerous divide. What could be seen could be claimed. What could not be seen was treated as empty. Coastal maps enabled the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. Ports were mapped and routes optimized. Human lives were reduced to cargo paths. Maps became tools of exploitation. As European knowledge grew, maps grew more aggressive. Africa was no longer a land of kingdoms and cultures. It became a resource waiting to be taken. Names were changed to honor European kings and saints. Indigenous names were erased. By the time the 17th century arrived, maps of Africa reflected European desire. rather than African reality. The continent was drawn smaller in importance and larger in opportunity. This perception justified violence. It justified slavery. It justified domination. A map drawn in Europe could decide the fate of a village thousands of miles away. African voices were absent from these drawings, their knowledge ignored, their borders dismissed. This imbalance set the stage for the most dramatic mapping event in African history. The moment when Africa would be carved not by rivers or cultures but by rulers and rulers alone. The age of partition was coming, and with it maps that would shatter the continent forever. The 19th century marked a turning point when maps stopped observing Africa and started dividing it. European powers no longer saw Africa as distant land, but as a prize to be claimed. Industrial growth in Europe demanded raw materials and new markets. Maps became planning documents for conquest. Explorers were sent not to learn, but to report. Rivers were traced not for curiosity, but for control. Each expedition returned with sketches, measurements, and names that fed into imperial map rooms. Africa slowly transformed from a continent of nations into a puzzle of possessions. The most powerful moment came in 1884 at the Berlin Conference. No African leader was invited, yet the future of Africa was decided there. European rulers gathered around tables covered with maps. They drew straight lines across forests, deserts, and rivers. These lines ignored languages, traditions, and histories. A single stroke could split a tribe between two empires. Another could force rival groups into one colony. The map created at Berlin did not reflect reality. It created a new one. This map legalized conquest. It turned invasion into administration. Countries like Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and Portugal claimed territories by color-coding the land. Africa became a checkerboard of foreign rule. The Congo Free State was one of the darkest examples. On maps, it appeared as a single entity under King Leopold of Belgium. In reality, it was a vast prison. Rubber extraction routes were mapped with precision. Villages were connected not for unity, but for exploitation. Millions died because a map defined ownership without responsibility. Elsewhere, borders cut across ancient trade routes. The Sahara, once a bridge, became a barrier. West African kingdoms lost coherence. North and sub-Saharan Africa were separated by artificial divisions. Maps redefined identity. People woke up under new flags without moving an inch. Colonial maps also controlled knowledge. Schools taught African children European maps. Indigenous geography was dismissed as folklore. Mountains were renamed. Rivers were claimed. Even time zones were imposed. The map reshaped how Africans saw themselves. Resistance existed, but maps favored the powerful. Rebellions were crushed using mapped routes and boundaries. The map was always one step ahead. As the 20th century began, colonial maps hardened into permanence. They were printed, distributed, and enforced. What started as temporary lines became national borders. When independence movements rose, they faced a terrible choice. Reject the colonial map and risk chaos, or accept it and inherit its problems. Most chose acceptance. The Organization of African Unity agreed to keep colonial borders to prevent endless conflict. This decision stabilized nations but preserved historical wounds. Maps that once served empires now defined states. Conflicts in places like Nigeria, Sudan, Rwanda, and the Horn of Africa trace back to these lines. Ethnic tensions, political instability, and civil wars all echo the same origin. A map drawn without African voices. The tragedy is not just what was lost, but what was frozen. Cultures that once flowed across regions were locked behind borders. Trade networks were broken. Mobility was restricted. The map that promised order delivered division. Yet even within these limits, Africans adapted. New identities formed. New nations emerged. But the shadow of colonial mapping remains. Every election dispute, border conflict, and secession movement carries the weight of those old drawings. The map did not end history. It redirected it. And its influence continues to shape the continent today. As colonial rule tightened, maps began shaping not just land, but the mind. European administrators believed that to rule Africa, they must first define it. Censuses, surveys, and boundary commissions spread across the continent. These were presented as neutral scientific acts, but they carried deep consequences. People were categorized, labeled, and fixed into identities that had once been fluid. Ethnic groups were mapped as if they were permanent and separate. This was not how Africans lived. Communities overlapped, intermarried, and shared space. The colonial map froze them into boxes. In places like Rwanda, colonial maps classified people as Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa with rigid boundaries. These identities were reinforced through maps and identity cards. Decades later, this mapping of identity would explode into violence. Elsewhere, pastoral communities who moved with seasons were trapped by borders. Nomadic routes that once ensured survival now crossed colonial lines and became illegal. Livelihoods collapsed because maps refused to move. In southern Africa, land maps were used to dispossess. Fertile areas were marked for settlers, while Africans were pushed into reserves. These reserves appeared small and crowded on maps because they were meant to be. Maps justified inequality by presenting it as order. In Kenya, Algeria, and South Africa, maps supported systems of segregation. Towns were divided, neighborhoods labeled, and movement controlled. The map became a daily instrument of oppression. Railways drawn on maps connected mines to ports, not people to opportunity. Roads avoided African towns and favored extraction. The geography of development followed the logic of colonial profit. This uneven mapping shaped economies long after independence. Capitals, ports, and rail hubs remained dominant while interiors struggled. During the World Wars, African maps gained strategic value. Colonies became supply routes, battlefields, and labor pools. Maps guided troop movements and resource extraction. African soldiers fought on lands mapped by others for causes not their own. After the wars, promises of reform emerged, but the maps remained unchanged. As independence movements grew, African leaders used maps as symbols of nationhood. Flags were raised over shapes inherited from empire. The outline of a country became sacred even if it made little sense. School children learned to draw their nation from memory. The map became identity. Yet beneath this unity lay unresolved fractures. Some leaders tried to redraw boundaries through secession or federation. Most failed. The cost of altering maps proved too high. International recognition depended on existing borders. Aid, diplomacy, and trade followed mapped lines. The world preferred stability over justice. As a result, the colonial map survived decolonization almost intact. This survival created paradoxes. Africa was politically free but geographically constrained. The map that once symbolized domination now symbolized sovereignty. Questioning it became taboo. But realities on the ground kept challenging it. Smugglers, migrants, and militants ignored borders. Rivers shifted, deserts expanded, and cities grew beyond lines on paper. The lived Africa refused to stay within mapped limits. Technology later added new layers. Satellite imagery improved accuracy but did not fix injustice. Digital maps made borders sharper, but lives remained complex. The problem was never precision, it was perspective. Maps had been drawn from above without listening below. This disconnect explains why many African states struggle with cohesion. The map tells one story. The people live another. Until these stories align, tension persists. The legacy of historical mapping is not just lines, but attitudes. A belief that order must come from outside, that authority flows from paper, that legitimacy is inherited, not negotiated. Challenging this mindset is the next stage of African mapping, one where maps reflect movement, memory, and meaning, not just control. The future of Africa depends on how it chooses to redraw not just borders, but narratives, while political borders dominated. Attention, another type of map, quietly reshaped. Africa, the economic map. Colonial powers did not only divide land, they redesigned value. Resource maps identified where wealth lived beneath the soil. Gold, diamonds, copper, oil, and rubber were marked and claimed. These maps decided which regions mattered and which were ignored. Development followed extraction, not people. Entire economies were built around what maps highlighted. In West Africa, cocoa and palm oil zones were outlined and controlled. In Central Africa, mineral belts dictated colonial investment. These economic maps created corridors of wealth that bypassed local needs. Ports expanded while villages remained isolated. After independence, these patterns stayed in place. New governments inherited economies structured by colonial mapping. Changing them required resources and unity that were hard to achieve. As a result, many African nations remained dependent on exporting raw materials, along the same routes drawn decades earlier. Economic vulnerability became a mapped reality. Another powerful map was the religious map. Missionaries charted regions by belief and influence. Christianity spread along colonial lines while Islam continued along ancient trade routes. These religious maps shaped education, politics, and conflict. In some regions, faith boundaries overlapped, with ethnic and political ones, intensifying division. Yet religion also connected Africa globally, creating networks of support, resistance, and identity. Cultural maps told another story. Languages were mapped, simplified, and standardized. Colonial administrators often reduced complex linguistic landscapes into a few official tongues. This decision favored some groups and marginalized others. Language maps influenced education, governance, and access to power. Even today, debates over official languages trace back to these early decisions. Environmental maps also played a role. Forests, wildlife, and water sources were mapped for control and conservation. National parks were created by drawing lines that excluded local communities. People who lived with land for generations were suddenly labeled intruders. Conservation maps protected nature but displaced humans. This tension continues today as Africa balances preservation with livelihoods. During the Cold War, Africa became a strategic map again. Superpowers viewed the continent through ideological lenses. Countries were colored red or blue based on alignment. Aid, weapons, and influence followed these markings. Internal conflicts were amplified by global rivalry. Africa became a chessboard on a world map far removed from local realities. When the Cold War ended, new maps emerged. Globalization introduced digital, financial, and migration maps. Cities like Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg became nodes on global networks. Informal settlements expanded beyond planned zones. The map of Africa became more dynamic but also more unequal. Urban maps showed growth while rural areas faded. Migration maps revealed movement toward opportunity and away from conflict. These movements challenged static national borders. Technology empowered Africans to create their own maps. Community mapping projects documented land use, culture, and history. These efforts reclaimed narrative power. Yet they struggled against entrenched official maps backed by law and capital. The struggle over mapping is ultimately a struggle over voice. Who gets to define reality? Whose knowledge counts? Africa stands at a crossroads. The old maps still govern borders, economies, and identities. New maps are emerging from below, reflecting lived experience. The tension between these visions defines the present. Understanding African history requires seeing maps not as neutral images but as active forces. Each era leaves its imprint through lines, symbols, and omissions. The past cannot be undone, but it can be reinterpreted. By reading maps critically, Africa can chart a future that honors its complexity. The story of African maps is unfinished. The next lines are still being drawn. Another powerful chapter in African mapping emerged through resistance and imagination. Africans did not simply accept imposed maps. They challenged them in subtle and direct ways. Oral traditions preserved alternative geographies. Songs, stories, and proverbs kept memory of old roots, homelands, and sacred spaces alive. Even when borders blocked movement, people remembered where they belonged. Anti-colonial leaders understood the power of maps. They used them to inspire unity and resistance. Pan-African thinkers imagined Africa as one connected land rather than fragmented colonies. Their mental maps crossed borders and revived shared history. This vision fueled independence movements. Maps of a united Africa appeared in speeches, posters, and dreams. Though political unity remained elusive, the idea reshaped identity. During liberation struggles, maps guided guerrilla warfare. Fighters moved through terrain using local knowledge ignored by colonial charts. Mountains, forests, and villages became strategic assets. This proved that official maps were incomplete. The land still belonged to those who knew it deeply. After independence, some leaders attempted ambitious remapping projects. They proposed federations, regional unions, and shared resources. The East African Community and other regional bodies reflected this thinking. These efforts aimed to soften colonial borders without erasing them. Progress was uneven, but the idea endured. Education became another battleground. African scholars began rewriting atlases. They restored indigenous names and histories. Maps started showing pre-colonial empires, trade routes, and cultural regions. This challenged narratives of emptiness and dependency. Museums and textbooks slowly changed perspective. Art also played a role. African artists reimagined maps to tell new stories. Some inverted the world, placing Africa at the center. Others fragmented borders to reveal pain and resilience. These artistic maps questioned authority and invited reflection. They reminded viewers that maps are interpretations, not truths. In recent decades, technology democratized mapping further. Mobile phones, satellites, and open platforms allowed communities to map themselves. Farmers mapped land rights. Activists mapped pollution and inequality. Historians mapped memory and loss. These grassroots maps challenged official records and influenced policy. In some cases, they prevented land grabs and protected heritage. Yet power imbalances remained. corporate and state maps still dominate infrastructure and investment decisions. The future of African mapping depends on bridging these scales, integrating local knowledge into national and global systems. Climate change adds urgency. Rising seas, droughts, and floods are redrawing Africa physically. Maps must now adapt to change rather than enforce permanence. Coastal cities face transformation. Pastoral routes may need restoration. New environmental maps must prioritize survival over profit. This moment offers opportunity. Africa can lead in creating flexible, humane mapping practices, ones that respect movement, diversity, and history. The lesson of the past is clear. When maps ignore, people suffering follows. When maps listen, resilience grows. African maps have changed history by shaping conquest, identity, and economy. They can change history again by guiding justice, adaptation, and unity. The pen that once divided can also heal. The map that once silenced can now speak. The story continues with those willing to redraw the future with care. Modern African politics cannot be understood without examining maps of power. Electoral boundaries, administrative regions, and capitals shape governance daily. Many African states inherited centralized systems, where power flows from a single point. Capitals were chosen for colonial convenience, not accessibility. Maps placed authority far from rural populations. This distance created mistrust and exclusion. Over time, decentralization efforts attempted to redraw internal maps. New regions, districts, and provinces were created to bring government closer to people. These changes were political acts. Redrawing internal boundaries could reduce conflict or ignite it. Leaders used maps to reward allies or weaken opponents. Ethnic balance, representation, and resource control all played roles. The map became a negotiation tool. In some countries, boundary reforms eased tensions by recognizing diversity. In others, they deepened divisions by appearing biased. Electoral maps carry even greater weight. Constituency boundaries decide representation. When poorly drawn, they dilute voices. Accusations of manipulation often arise. Citizens understand that a line on a map can determine their political future. This awareness fuels protest and demands for transparency. Beyond politics, security maps shape lives. Borders influence migration, trade, and conflict. Porous boundaries allow cultural exchange but also facilitate smuggling and militancy. Governments respond by reinforcing borders with checkpoints and surveillance. These measures alter daily geography. Communities that once moved freely now navigate restrictions. Security maps prioritize control over connection. Yet threats like terrorism and organized crime demand coordination across borders. Regional security maps and alliances attempt to balance sovereignty with cooperation. Success depends on trust and shared vision. Infrastructure maps reveal another layer. Roads, railways, and energy grids follow planned routes. These routes decide which areas grow and which stagnate. Large projects often mirror colonial patterns, linking extraction zones to ports. Efforts to build regional corridors aim to change this by connecting African economies to each other. Maps of continental integration, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, imagine a border-light future. Implementation remains challenging, but the vision is transformative. Digital maps are reshaping everyday life. Navigation, apps, logistics platforms, and data networks influence movement and commerce. African startups are creating localized mapping solutions, reflecting real conditions. Informal roads, markets, and services appear on digital maps that once ignored them. This inclusion empowers communities and entrepreneurs. However, data ownership raises questions. Who controls the digital map controls opportunity. Ensuring African ownership of mapping data is crucial for sovereignty. Education and innovation are key. Teaching critical map literacy helps. Citizens understand how maps influence decisions. Universities research alternative cartographies rooted in African perspectives. Young Africans are redefining mapping through technology, art, and activism. They see maps not as fixed truths, but as evolving tools. The challenge ahead is integration, bridging historical wounds with future needs. Using maps to heal rather than divide, Africa has the chance to lead the world in reimagining mapping for humanity. By centering people, ecology and memory maps can support sustainable development. The past shows the danger of imposed lines. The present shows the power of participation. The future depends on choosing which map to follow. At the end of this journey, it becomes clear that African maps were never just about geography. They were about who mattered and who did not. They were about whose voice shaped reality and whose was silenced. From ancient river paths to colonial borders, from resource grids to digital layers. Every map carried intention. Some intentions brought connection and survival. Others brought suffering and division. The greatest change in African history often began not with armies, but with ink. A line drawn far away could change how people lived, loved, and died. Yet Africa endured. Despite distortion, Africa adapted. Cultures crossed borders that tried to stop them. Memories survived erasure. People learned to live between lines while never fully accepting them. Today, Africa stands in a moment unlike any before. The old maps still exist, but they no longer fully control the story. Africans are mapping themselves again. They are naming their spaces, reclaiming histories, and redefining value. Technology allows voices from villages, cities, and deserts to be heard together. This does not erase the past, but it reshapes the future. The challenge now is responsibility. Maps must be drawn with care because they carry consequences. A development map can uplift or displace. A security map can protect or divide. A climate map can save lives or justify neglect. Africa knows the cost of careless mapping better than any continent. This knowledge is power. It offers wisdom the world urgently needs. As climate change, migration, and inequality reshape the planet, new maps will guide humanity. Africa can lead by example, by creating maps that honor movement, diversity, and dignity, by rejecting straight lines that ignore life, by choosing flexibility over force. The lesson of history is simple. When maps ignore people, history becomes violent. When maps listen, history can heal. Africa has been broken by maps, but never defined by them alone. The true map of Africa lives in its people, in how they remember, adapt, and imagine. Borders may remain, but meaning can change. The lines on paper are not destiny. They are choices. And choices can be redrawn. As you look at a map of Africa, again remember this. What you see is only a surface. Beneath it are stories older than any border, deeper than any line. The future map of Africa is still being written. And this time Africa holds the pen.